Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for this study. This is lesson 2 in our quarter. Today we're going to be in the book of Proverbs. If you'd like to turn to Proverbs chapter 4, that's where we will begin in just a moment. Yesterday I taught the high school class, and I began the class by asking the kids, how many of you have problems with your parents? And almost without fail, the whole class raised their hands. I suppose there are many reasons for that, so I asked them, why do you have problems? And the reasons were varied, but I think they were honest. Some said, well, they won't let me do what I want to do. Or another way to say it is selfishness on the child said my part. Another said communication. Another said, well, my father and I are too much alike. When you think about the aspect of communication, we talked about that a lot. Communication is not just one-sided. It's not just the speaking. Communication also has to do with listening. And the fault of listening is not just on one side. It's not just that the children aren't listening to the parents. It's that when the children are speaking, sometimes, maybe many times, the parents aren't listening to the children. Oh, no one's interrupting, but we're listening with a view to how we're going to answer, how we're going to respond. Not listening with a view to trying to comprehend what is being said, with a view to trying to understand what is being said. And as a parent, I realized the challenge of that. There were times in which I simply was not interested in what my children had to say. And there were times in which I needed to listen to them, but I didn't listen to them as closely and as well as I should have. Well, Proverbs chapter 4 helps us understand a lot about this relationship. For example, we begin in verse 1. It says, "Hear, O sons, the instruction of a father, and give attention that you may gain understanding. For I give you sound teaching. Do not abandon my instruction. When I was a son to my father, tender, and the only son in the side of my mother, they taught me and said to me, let your heart hold fast my words, keep my commandments, and live." Let's pause there. The statement in verse 3, when I was a son to my father, tender and the only son in the side of my mother. Wouldn't it be wonderful if our children felt that way about us as parents when they're grown? That they feel that's how we treated them? I don't know whether Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 3 is saying that this is the only son. Maybe this is Solomon looking at Rehoboam, I'm not sure. Maybe this is David looking at Solomon. David had more sons, but maybe he's looking at Solomon. But nonetheless, he said, tender and the only son in the side of my mother. He was special. This son was special. What a blessing to think back on our childhood, to think that we were special to our parents. But let's go back to verse 1 and look at a few things. First of all, notice the word hear. Hear. And give attention. I asked the class, when you have a dog and you whistle for the dog, what do the dog's ears do? Well, they said the dog's ears perk up. If you've ever had a horse and you whistle for the horse, the horse's ears perk up. They perk up to listen. They perk up to give attention. And so here you have the instruction, hear, O sons. Hear, O sons. I'm not sure that Solomon is here talking about little children. It may be Solomon's talking to more mature children. And says, hear what I have to say. And give attention. The way he wants us to hear is by giving attention to what is said. For what purpose? He says that what? You may gain understanding. Gaining understanding is a result of hearing and giving attention. Attention to what? He says sound teaching. And then he says, do not abandon. The New King James says, do not forsake. Forsake is to abandon. Abandon is to forsake. They are complementary of one another. And so he says, this teaching that I'm giving you, son, hear this, pay attention to it, and get understanding, and don't leave it. Don't abandon it. I'm teaching you sound things. And then he says, let your heart hold fast to my words. Again, the New King James says, take a firm grip. If you've ever been water skiing, you know when the boat begins to pull and the rope tightens, and you're the skier, and you give the nod for the person driving the boat to hit the gas to pull you up, you better have a firm grip on the handles. A firm grip. If you don't, they'll slip out, and you'll sink back down, and you won't come up. I think about a baseball player. He needs a firm grip. Not necessarily a tight, choking grip, but a firm grip. A golfer needs a firm grip on his golf clubs. Golfers aren't supposed to choke, hold the grip so tight they choke the club, but to hold a firm grip. We understand what that means. If you're working with a hammer, you want a firm grip on the hammer. And so here he says, you take and have a firm grip. You hear, you give attention. So you get understanding with the sound words, these healthy words, these strong words I'm giving you. Don't abandon them. Hold on to them tightly. Hold on to them tightly. So here you have the instruction of the parent. And you have the being taught by the child. Someone may say, well, yeah, that's rather idealistic. My children don't do that. Well, there's no doubt that we go through challenges with our children, but guess what? We go through challenges with adults too. And here's another great revelation. Your parents went through some of the same challenges with you. You might have forgotten. I know there were times I didn't want to hear what my mother and daddy had to say. I wasn't interested at all in putting a firm grip on what they had to say. As I've grown older, I realized I was holding a firm grip on some of the things they taught me more than I realized. Why? Because they were sound words. Parents want to give their children sound words and hold on to them. Then notice what he says in verse 5. Acquire wisdom. Again, the New King James will say, get wisdom and get understanding, or acquire understanding. Do not forget nor turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will guard you. Love her, and she will watch over you. The beginning of wisdom is to acquire wisdom or get wisdom, and with all you're getting or acquiring, get understanding. In verse 5, through this section we read through verse 7, he's personifying wisdom. That is, if wisdom were a person, this is what wisdom as a person would be saying, would look like. And wisdom would be saying, and wisdom's pleading, get wisdom, get wisdom. And with that, you get understanding. And as you acquire that wisdom, as you get that wisdom and get more understanding, he says, don't forget nor turn from my paths. Don't forget nor turn away from the words of my mouth. Down in verses 13 through 14, we find a practical aspect of this. Take hold of instruction and do not let go. Guard her, for she is your life. Here is this wisdom. Guard her. We'll say something more about that in just a moment. But he says, what's the beginning of wisdom? It's to acquire wisdom. And with all our acquiring, we get understanding. You know, young people can't help the fact they are where they are in their growth and their maturity. There are some things about wisdom that just come from having a PhD from the University of Hard Knocks. Maybe we start out with an AAHD, that is an associate's degree of hard knocks. And then maybe we progress to a BHD, that is a Bachelor of Hard Knocks. And then maybe we acquire an MHD, the Master of Hard Knocks. But we get a PhD in the University of Hard Knocks. We've gained some wisdom and we've gained some understanding because of the life experiences that we have had. But you can also gain understanding and wisdom from watching others as well, from being an example, from following example of others. In fact, in Philippians chapter 3 and verse 17, Paul will say, we are to watch closely men who are like him to have as an example. Watch these men, he says, that are an example. He says of Timothy, I have no man like-minded who will naturally care for your estate. Watch him, keep your eye on him. And so sometimes wisdom comes from example. In fact, he'll talk about that in just a moment. Notice what happens in verse 8 then. Prize her and she will exalt you. Prize or treasure. She will honor you if you embrace her. Speaking of wisdom. She'll place on your head a garland of grace. She'll present you with a crown of beauty. He says, if you exalt wisdom, if you prize wisdom, when we think of exalting, you think of exalting someone. You think about putting them high above. And you think about a prize. Prize and exalt. That which we exalt, we often prize. We love, we cherish, we hold tightly. But notice, she will honor you if you embrace her. Here we're back to the hold firmly. She'll honor you if you embrace her. Embrace wisdom. Don't run from wisdom. Embrace wisdom. Listen, he says, make it a part of who you are. And then it says, she will place on your head a garland of grace, and she'll what? Present you with a crown of beauty. Basically, what he's saying there is, you'll get the gold medal. If you listen, if you hear with giving attention to gain understanding to the sound doctrine that's taught and do not abandon it, then what he's going to say is you will be treasured. You'll be prized because wisdom will what? Wisdom will adorn you with what? A gold medal. So he says you hold tightly. In the acquiring of wisdom, you hold tightly to her. This wisdom is precious and cherished. Again, wisdom is personified. And so you reach out and you hold wisdom tightly. You embrace her. Embrace her with love. Embrace her with all the affection that you have. You pull wisdom in close to you, and she'll what? She'll give you the gold medal. Because with wisdom, you get understanding. And that's true with all of our relationships. That's true with all of our experiences in life that are not part of human relationships. And really, this is important in the parent-child relationship. Because in the parent-child relationship, we're trying to teach our children and impart to them understanding. And we want them to pay close attention to us. And the teaching that we give, we want them to hold on to. Buy the truth and sell it not. That's what we want them to do. We want them to hold on to that wisdom and pull it tight so when rough days come, they have that wisdom to reflect upon. They have that wisdom to draw on. That wisdom will guide them. That wisdom will lead them because they've held tightly to it. They've cherished it. They have embraced it. He says, that's this wisdom I want you to get. Then he says, verse 10, hear my son, accept my sayings, and the years of your life will be many. I've directed you in the ways of wisdom. I've led you in upright paths. When you walk, your steps will not be impeded, and if you run, you'll not stumble. Take hold of instruction. Do not let go. Guard her, for she is your life. Don't enter the path of the wicked, and do not proceed in the way of the evil men. Notice again, he says, hear my son. Accept what I'm saying. Don't just hear, but give attention to it. Accept what I'm saying. And notice, the years of your life will be many. I'm not sure what he's saying there is you're going to have a guarantee of life, long life. But what he's saying is if you do this, the years that you live, they will seem many and it'll be a whole lot easier way. If you walk, he says, in the steps that I have given you, when you walk, your walk and your steps will not be impeded. Nothing's going to trip you up. When you run, you'll not stumble. Why? Because you know where to put your feet. With a high school class, we define wisdom two ways. One is knowing the end from the beginning. And that experience in life from the University of Hard Knocks helps us see that a lot of times. And that's why with our children, we tell them no sometimes because we see something and we know the end from the beginning that they don't know. They kick back and push back against us because they don't have that insight. They don't have that understanding. The second definition that we've given is stable judgment. If you've ever walked through a stable, you need the judgment of knowing where to put your feet. Because if you don't pay attention to where you put your feet, you'll get a lot of manure on your boot or on your shoe. And what he's saying in life, he says, listen to him. When you walk, your steps will not be. You'll know where to put your feet. Be careful where you put your feet, because life under the sun has a lot of manure to it. And you'll get a lot of manure on your feet if you don't watch where you're stepping. And that's why he says in verse 13, as I said, we'll mention this later, take hold of instruction. Do not let go of her. Guard her, for she is your life. You'll know where to step. Why? Because you're guarding her. You're holding her close. You're embracing her. You're holding on firmly and tightly to that wisdom. Wisdom is precious and cherished to you, and you have exalted wisdom. You have heard, you understood, you've taken it in, you've embraced it. And now it helps you see where to put your feet. It helps you see the end from the beginning. Boy, we need that in life. Whether we're old or whether we're young, we need that in life. Look back at Proverbs chapter 3 just a moment. And look at verses 11 and 12. My son, do not reject the discipline of the Lord or loathe his reproof. For whom the Lord loves, he reproves, even as a father corrects the son in whom he delights. Sometimes that discipline comes in the form of teaching. Sometimes that wisdom comes in the form of imparting information to gain knowledge. And so what he's saying here is, don't reject the discipline or the teaching of the Lord, the instruction, the correction, the reproof, the rebuke of the Lord. The Lord ultimately gives us our wisdom. And this book imparts that wisdom to us. And when the Lord reproves us through his word, and maybe through the example of others, he says, don't reject it. Pay close attention to it. Look at Proverbs chapter 20. Proverbs chapter 20. And look at verse 11. Proverbs chapter 20 and verse 11. It is by his deeds that a lad distinguishes himself. Again, the New King James says, one is known by their behavior, if his conduct is right and pure. How can we know the kind of life? How can we know where we're walking? How can we know the steps we're taking? How can we know where we're putting our feet? By our behavior. In the book of Matthew, he will talk about the fruit a tree bears. A good tree will bear good fruit. If the fruit's bad, you know the tree's bad. When we look at the fruit of a person's life, it tells us if that person's continuing in pure and right conduct. It's not rocket science. We say we can't read hearts, and that's right. We can't read hearts, but there's something about the fruit in our life that is produced that tells us something about what we value and what we prize. Can you think of this wisdom that he's talking about, that if we value and prize that, it's going to help us direct our steps in the right path? And we'll avoid the evil that's there. Again, we'll avoid the evil. Don't turn to the way of evil. We'll avoid that. Look at Proverbs chapter 1. Look at Proverbs chapter 1. Look at Proverbs chapter 1. As we look at Proverbs chapter 1, notice what he will say in verse 17. Indeed, it is useless to spread the baited net in the sight of any bird. Why? Because a bird sees the danger. And seeing the danger, the bird flies away. And so back up to verse 10, he said, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. Again, see the end from the beginning. The path that sinners are trying to draw you on, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent. Here's the excitement, the thrill of it. Here they entice us to do something's wrong because of the thrill of it. Again, a person is known by their behavior, whether they're pure or right. Let us swallow them like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. He said, we will find all kinds of precious wealth. We'll fill our houses with spoil. Here are riches. Here's gain, treasures they're going to take by robbing others. Just the thrill of taking something from somebody else that's not yours. Maybe they know it, maybe they don't know it. But he says that always ends in the pit. He says, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from your path. For their feet run to evil, and they hasten to shed blood. Here they take innocent life. They want you to join them. There's a sense of belonging there. There's a sense of identity there. They entice you to be part of their group for the thrill, for what you can gain, for the treasures that are there. But they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. And then he says, wisdom shouts in the streets. She lifts her voice in the squares. But then he says, the time comes in which wisdom will no longer cry. Wisdom will no longer make the appeal. And then the time is going to come in which you want wisdom. We want wisdom. And we call for wisdom. And wisdom says, wait a minute, who are you? I tried to help you and you wouldn't listen. You wouldn't pay attention. You wouldn't hold firmly to what I'm giving you. You've abandoned me. And now you want me? Now that you're in the storm, you want to know how to navigate? Since you want to know how to make it through the storm, that you're in the storm? No. Wisdom is calling and saying, I'm trying to tell you how to live through the storm before you enter the storm. But here, no, you follow the path of evil. You pursued the evil, and you abandoned wisdom. You gave up wisdom. The tragedy of it. Look at Proverbs chapter 29. Proverbs chapter 29 and verses 15 through 17. The rod and reproof. He said, the rod and reproof give wisdom. The child who gets his own way brings shame to his mother. When the wicked increase, transgressions increase, but the righteous will see their fall. Correct your son, he will give you comfort. He'll delight you, and he will delight your soul also. What he says is, if you don't correct your children and you leave them to themselves, what does it mean to leave a child to himself? Well, weeds grow up all by themselves, don't they? Weeds don't need instruction. Weeds don't need understanding. Weeds certainly don't profit from wisdom. But a child left to himself brings destruction. And that's why he talks about the rod and reproof. And he talks about the discipline. Again, the discipline is not always corporal. Maybe that's needed, but it's not always corporal. Maybe that should be the last thing we exercise instead of the first thing we exercise. If what we're trying to do is shape hearts and build character, then that teaching and correcting is paramount. And that teaching and correcting builds that wisdom, builds that understanding that will help them gain wisdom. But notice what he says. A child who gets his own way or left to himself brings shame to his mother. Haven't you seen that child? Haven't you seen that child that just kicks and screams and pitches a fit and wants its own way? And what do you think about that child? What do you think about those parents? Is it the parents need correcting or the child needs correcting? In that case, is it a child problem or a parent problem? I remember my favorite philosopher, Andy Griffith, there's an episode in which a new boy moves to town. And he's got a shiny new bicycle. He's riding it on the sidewalk. He's running over people coming out of the grocery store. Barney warns him not to ride his bike on the street anymore, and he continues to do it. Finally, he rides by and almost runs over Andy. And Andy scolds the boy and says, you're not supposed to ride this bike on the street. The little boy sticks out a tongue and goes, man, and then takes off riding. And Andy, before the boy can get away, picks up the bike and says, I told you not to ride this bike on the street. Now I'm going to impound this bike. And the little boy screams and said, give me my bike. This is my bike. You can't take my bike. And Andy says, you better stop it right now. I'm going to get your father. Well, along the way, this little boy is trying to teach Opie how to get his way. He tells Opie, hold your breath. He tells Opie to get on the floor and waddle about and scream like you're having a fit. He tells Opie to jump up and down. Opie does all that. He holds his breath, and Andy says, what are you doing? He says, holding my breath. He said, well, don't hold it too long. He's on the floor pitching a fit, and he says, what are you doing? He says, I'm having a fit. Andy said, don't get your clothes dirty. About that time, the little boy with his father comes in. And the father begins to jump on Andy for taking the boy's bike. He said, this boy, you don't understand this boy. This boy requires special understanding. Andy said, we warned the boy not to ride his bike on the bicycle on the sidewalk. And rode his bicycle on the sidewalk. And now we're going to keep the bicycle. The little boy slammed his fist on the table and said, I want my bike. I want my bike. Give me my bike. And Andy tells the little boy to quiet or he's going to put his father in jail. He says, go ahead, I want my bike. About that time, the light bulb comes on to the father. He puts his hands firmly on the little boy's shoulders and said, Sheriff, give me that bike. You don't need to keep that bike. And the little boy just smiles. And the father says, because I'm going to sell it. And the little boy pitches and screams. Andy says, would you like a good old woodshed? There's one out back. The father says, yes, I think that's what's needed. See, here's a little boy left to himself. He was an embarrassment to everybody. A child left to himself without discipline, without training, without instruction, without teaching, without instructing good, sound teaching to give understanding, to gain wisdom. A child left to himself is a misery to their mother. It brings destruction on the child and everybody else. The challenge of parenting is to burn my will of the child into thy will, the parent, and ultimately thy will of the father. That's the purpose of teaching. That's the purpose of instructing. And that's what Solomon tells us here in these Psalms. He says, here, give attention. Pay close attention. You'll get wisdom. Hold on tightly to it. Don't abandon it. When you acquire her, prize her and exalt her, and she'll show you where to put your feet, and she'll help you know the end from the beginning, and she'll help you know the kind of people to stay away from. And if we train our children that way, it'll keep them from being ashamed to themselves and everyone else. These Proverbs are so rich. Thank you for joining me today. Jordan will have a lesson next week. Hope this is beneficial to you as you think about these things. God bless you, and Jody and I love you. Stay safe.